The moment they realize you don't care anymore is the moment everything they relied on begins to slip out of their control. Because it's not your anger they fear, it's your indifference. And when that shows up, their behavior changes in ways that may completely surprise you. If you've ever reached a point where you felt nothing, no urgency, no need to explain, no desire to fix, stay with me, because what happens next reveals more about the dynamic than anything that came before. Subscribe if you're choosing peace over emotional chaos. Comment "I don't care anymore" if you've reached that point. Like this video to support others finding their strength. And remember, your indifference is your freedom. When a person who once cared deeply reaches a point of emotional indifference, one of the first things that happens on the other side of the dynamic is testing. Not always in obvious or dramatic ways, but in subtle, calculated, and sometimes confusing patterns of behavior designed to answer one question: is this change real, or is it temporary? For a long time, the relationship may have followed a predictable rhythm. You responded, you engaged, you explained, you reacted. Even when there was distance or conflict, there was still a sense that your emotional presence remained available, that no matter what happened, you would eventually return to the familiar pattern of interaction. That predictability created a kind of certainty, not necessarily appreciation, but certainty. And now, that certainty is gone, so the testing begins. At first, it may look harmless, a casual message, a neutral check-in, something that does not directly address the past, but quietly reopens the line of communication. These initial attempts are often designed to see if you will respond in the same way you used to. If you do, the conclusion is simple. Nothing has changed. The pattern is still active. The emotional access is still available. But if your response is different, shorter, calmer, or absent altogether, then the testing becomes more intentional. Because now there is uncertainty, and uncertainty creates a need for confirmation. You may notice a shift in tone. Messages may become more frequent or slightly more engaging. There may be references to shared experiences, subtle reminders of the past, or attempts to spark a reaction that once came easily. These are not random. They are attempts to locate the version of you that used to respond, to see if it still exists. If you remain consistent, calm, detached, and non-reactive, the testing may increase in intensity. Because the usual signals are no longer working. There may be moments of charm, warmth that feels familiar, words that resemble the earlier stages of the connection. These are not always insincere, but they are often strategic in timing. They appear when distance becomes noticeable, when your silence creates a gap that did not exist before. The purpose is not always to repair. It is often to re-engage, to draw you back into a space where your emotional responses can be accessed again. If charm does not produce the expected reaction, the approach may change, frustration may appear, confusion may be expressed. There may be subtle or direct questions about your behavior. Why are you acting different? Or what changed? These questions are not always about understanding. They are about disruption. Because your change disrupts the established pattern, and disruption creates discomfort. In some cases, testing can take the form of provocation, statements or actions that are designed to trigger a reaction, not necessarily to create conflict, but to confirm whether emotional engagement is still possible. Because even a negative reaction is still a reaction. And reaction means connection is still active. But when there is no reaction or a minimal controlled one, the signal becomes clear. Something has changed, and it is not temporary. This is where the testing reaches its most important phase. Because now, it is no longer about small attempts. It becomes about understanding the new reality. You are no longer responding from the same emotional place. You are no longer engaging with the same urgency. You are no longer participating in the dynamic in the way you once did. And this realization shifts the entire interaction. Because what was once predictable is now uncertain. What was once accessible is now limited. What was once automatic is now intentional. For you, this stage requires awareness. Because testing can be subtle. It can appear as kindness, as curiosity, as concern. And without clarity, it is easy to misinterpret these signals as change rather than as attempts to restore familiarity. But the key difference lies in consistency. Testing is reactive. It adjusts based on your behavior. It increases when you withdraw. It decreases when you engage. Real change, on the other hand, is steady. It does not depend on your reaction. It exists regardless of your response. And recognizing this difference allows you to remain grounded. because your role in this phase is not to pass or fail the test. It is to stay aligned with your own clarity, to respond if you choose from a place of intention rather than habit, to maintain the emotional boundary that you have established. Because every time you respond in the old way, the system receives a signal, the pattern can return. And every time you remain consistent in your new way, the system receives a different signal, the pattern has changed. This is where your power lies. Not in controlling the outcome, not in proving a point, but in maintaining your position. Because testing only continues as long as there is uncertainty, and your consistency removes that uncertainty over time. It communicates without words that your shift is real, that your emotional availability is no longer automatic, that your engagement is now a choice, not a default. And once that message is clear, the testing loses its purpose, because the answer has been given, not through explanation, but through behavior. Steady, calm, unchanged, and rooted in a place that no longer depends on being pulled back into what you have already outgrown. When it becomes clear that your indifference is real, that it is not temporary or emotional fluctuation but a grounded and lasting shift, the next thing that often happens is an intensification of attempts to pull you back in. This phase can be confusing because it may look on the surface like effort, like care, even like change. But what is actually happening is a response to the loss of emotional access that once came easily. For a long time, your engagement may have been predictable. Your reactions, your willingness to communicate, your openness to reconnect. These created a structure where connection could be restored without much effort from the other side. Even after tension or distance, there was an underlying expectation that things would return to normal once you re-engaged. Now, that expectation no longer holds. Your silence, your calm distance, your reduced emotional response, these create a gap that did not exist before. And that gap is not neutral. It carries weight. It signals that something fundamental has changed. At first, the attempts to reconnect may seem small, a message that feels thoughtful, a tone that feels softer than before. Perhaps even a level of attentiveness that was not consistently present in the past. These initial efforts are often designed to reopen communication in a way that feels safe and familiar. If those attempts do not produce the expected response, they begin to intensify, because the usual level of effort is no longer enough. The dynamic has shifted, and in order to restore it, more energy is required. This is where you may begin to notice an increase in frequency, more messages, more attempts to reach you, more moments where your attention is being sought. The communication may become more engaging, more emotionally expressive, or more persistent. There may be reminders of shared experiences, references to moments that once held meaning, attempts to bring back a sense of connection that feels familiar to you. These are not random. They are targeted efforts to activate your emotional memory. Because emotional memory is powerful, it can soften boundaries, it can create doubt. It can make distance feel temporary rather than necessary. And when these reminders appear, they are often intended to reconnect you to a version of the relationship that once felt meaningful. If emotional memory does not lead to re-engagement, the approach may shift again. There may be expressions of vulnerability, statements that suggest regret, confusion, or even emotional struggle. These can feel very real, and in some cases they may be partially genuine. But timing matters. When vulnerability appears only after access is lost, it is important to observe whether it is consistent or situational, because consistent growth shows up over time, regardless of your response. Situational vulnerability appears when connection is at risk. If even this does not lead to the desired response, intensity can increase further. There may be urgency, a sense that something needs to be resolved immediately. Questions that demand answers, statements that attempt to draw you into dialogue. In some cases, there may even be a shift toward frustration, not necessarily aggressive, but noticeable. A tone that reflects discomfort with the lack of control over the situation. Because your indifference has removed something that was once relied upon, your emotional availability. And without that availability, the dynamic feels unstable. This is why the attempts intensify, not always because of deep understanding, but because of disruption. The system that once worked is no longer functioning in the same way, and the response is to increase effort in order to restore it. For you, this phase requires clarity, because intensity can be misinterpreted as importance, effort can be mistaken for change, persistence can be confused with commitment. But there is a difference between intensity and consistency. Intensity is reactive. It rises when something is lost. It adjusts based on your behavior. Consistency, on the other hand, is steady. It does not depend on whether you respond. It does not appear only when distance increases. It is present over time, regardless of circumstances. Recognizing this difference allows you to stay grounded, because your role is not to respond to intensity. It is to remain aligned with your own clarity, to observe without being pulled back into patterns that you have already stepped away from, to remember why your indifference developed in the first place. Because indifference is not the absence of feeling, it is the result of understanding. It is what happens when repeated experiences lead to a shift in emotional investment, and that shift is not easily reversed by temporary changes in behavior. As you maintain your position, something important begins to happen. The intensified attempts lose their impact, not immediately, but gradually. Because when effort does not produce the expected response, it eventually adjusts. And what you begin to see more clearly is this. The attempts were not about rebuilding something new. They were about restoring something old. And once you recognize that, your perspective changes. You are no longer deciding whether to go back. You are deciding whether the pattern itself is worth re-entering. And that decision becomes easier when you remain grounded in what you have already learned, because the intensity you are seeing now did not exist when you were fully available. It appeared when you stepped back. And that alone tells you something important, that your absence changed the level of effort, not your presence. And that awareness is what allows you to stay steady, not reactive, not confused, but clear. Clear enough to understand that not all effort is growth and not all intensity is truth. When it becomes clear that your indifference is real and consistent, one of the most noticeable shifts in behavior is the movement between two extremes, charm and frustration. This is not random. It is a response to the loss of emotional predictability that once defined the dynamic. When someone can no longer rely on a steady emotional reaction from you, they begin to alternate strategies in an attempt to find what still works. In the earlier stages of the relationship, charm may have played a significant role. Warmth, attentiveness, engaging conversation, moments that felt meaningful or even deeply connecting, these are not always false, but they are often tied to moments when emotional engagement is strong, when you were responsive, when you were invested, when you were participating fully. Charm could flow more naturally because it was being reinforced. Now, with your emotional distance in place, charm takes on a different function. It becomes a tool, not necessarily in a conscious or calculated way every time, but in a patterned way. It reappears when connection feels at risk. It shows up when distance becomes noticeable. It is often timed with moments when your silence or indifference creates uncertainty. You may notice messages that feel unusually kind, a tone that seems softer than before, compliments, shared memories, or expressions that resemble the earlier, more positive phases of the connection. These moments can feel disarming, especially if they reflect a version of the interaction that once meant something to you. And that is precisely why they are powerful, because charm connects to emotional memory. It reminds you of what the relationship felt like at its best. It creates a temporary bridge between your current clarity and your past emotional investment. But what is important to recognize is not just the presence of charm, it is its inconsistency. Because when charm does not produce the expected re-engagement, it often gives way to something else. Frustration. This frustration does not always appear as overt anger. It can be subtle, a shift in tone, a sense of impatience. Questions that carry an edge of irritation. Statements that reflect confusion or discomfort with your lack of response. You may hear things like, "Why are you acting like this?" or "I don't understand what changed." These statements are not always about seeking understanding. They are about confronting the disruption. Because your indifference disrupts the emotional flow that once existed, and disruption creates tension. When charm no longer restores the connection, frustration begins to surface because the usual pathway back to engagement is no longer effective. This back and forth between charm and frustration can feel confusing if you are not aware of the pattern. One moment, the interaction feels warm and familiar. The next, it feels tense or uncomfortable. One moment, there is an attempt to reconnect. The next, there is pressure or irritation. This inconsistency is not accidental. It reflects an attempt to navigate a situation where the usual emotional responses are no longer available. From your perspective, this is where clarity becomes essential, because without clarity, it is easy to respond to the charm and overlook the pattern. It is easy to interpret warmth as change without recognizing that it appears only when distance increases. It is easy to feel unsettled by frustration and respond in an attempt to restore calm. But both responses, engaging with charm and reacting to frustration, can pull you back into the dynamic you have stepped away from. This is why consistency on your side matters. because the alternation between charm and frustration depends on one thing: your reaction. If charm works, it will be repeated. If frustration works, it will be used again. But if neither produces the expected emotional engagement, the pattern begins to lose its effectiveness. For you, this stage is about observation rather than participation. You begin to see the rhythm of the interaction without being pulled into it. You notice when charm appears and you recognize its timing. You notice when frustration surfaces and you understand what triggered it. And in that awareness, you create distance, not just physically or emotionally, but psychologically. You are no longer inside the pattern, you are watching it. And that shift changes everything. Because once you see the pattern clearly, it becomes harder to respond automatically. You begin to choose your responses more carefully, or in some cases, you choose not to respond at all. And that choice is not about ignoring or avoiding, it is about maintaining alignment with the clarity you have gained. Because your indifference is not accidental. It is the result of understanding what the dynamic has been. And once you understand that, reacting to alternating behaviors becomes less compelling. You no longer feel the need to chase the warmth or resolve the frustration. You simply remain steady. And in that steadiness, the pattern begins to weaken. Because it no longer produces the same results. Charm does not pull you back. Frustration does not push you to respond. And without those reactions, the cycle cannot sustain itself in the same way. This is where your emotional position becomes stable, not because the other person has changed, but because your responses have. You are no longer moving between their extremes. You are staying grounded in your own. And that grounded state is what ultimately allows you to remain free from the cycle you once felt pulled into. Because when charm and frustration no longer influence your behavior, their power over the dynamic begins to fade. And what remains is your clarity, unchanged, steady, and no longer dependent on the emotional shifts happening around you. When someone realizes that your emotional investment has truly changed, that you are no longer reacting, no longer engaging in the same way, no longer offering the same level of attention, one of the deepest shifts that occurs is their struggle with the loss of emotional influence. This is not always visible on the surface, but it is a profound internal disruption because much of the previous dynamic may have depended on their ability to affect your emotional state. Emotional influence in this context is not about simple interaction. It is about impact. The ability to say something and receive a reaction. The ability to create distance and feel your pull to reconnect. The ability to trigger concern, curiosity, or even frustration and know that it will lead to engagement. Over time, this influence becomes part of the structure of the relationship. Before your shift, your responses may have been consistent. You cared, you reacted, you explained, you tried to resolve. Even when you were hurt, your emotional presence remained active. This created a feedback loop where your reactions reinforced the connection, regardless of whether the interaction was positive or negative. And that feedback loop provided a sense of control. Not necessarily conscious control, but functional control. The ability to predict and influence the flow of the interaction. Now, with your indifference in place, that feedback loop begins to disappear. There is no longer a reliable reaction. There is no longer a predictable emotional response. There is no longer a consistent sense of how their actions will affect you. And this is where the struggle begins. Because when emotional influence is lost, uncertainty replaces it. They may begin to notice that the same words no longer produce the same reactions, that the same behaviors no longer lead to the same outcomes, that the emotional connection no longer moves in response to their actions. This creates a kind of instability, because what once felt manageable through interaction now feels disconnected. They may try different approaches, changing tone, adjusting behavior, increasing effort, not necessarily out of understanding, but out of a need to restore that lost influence, because influence provides a sense of relevance. It confirms that the connection is still active. It reassures that their presence still affects you. But when you remain steady, calm, non-reactive, emotionally distant, that confirmation does not come. And without it, something important is challenged. The assumption that your emotional state can be shaped by their actions. This is not always processed consciously. It may not be something they can clearly articulate, but it is felt through the lack of response, the absence of reaction, the quiet distance that replaces what used to be engagement. For you, this stage is where your power becomes very clear. Not because you are trying to influence the situation, but because you are no longer being influenced by it. You are no longer adjusting your emotional state based on their behavior. You are no longer reacting in ways that sustain the dynamic. You are no longer providing the emotional feedback that once kept the cycle moving, and this creates a new kind of stability, internal stability. Because your emotional world is no longer dependent on external triggers. You are not pulled into urgency. You are not drawn into reaction. You are not compelled to respond in order to restore balance. Instead, you remain grounded. And that grounded state is what makes the loss of influence so significant. Because influence requires movement, it requires change in response, it requires emotional engagement that can be shaped. Without those elements, influence cannot function in the same way. And this is where the shift becomes irreversible. Because once you have experienced this level of detachment, this ability to remain steady regardless of external behavior, it becomes very difficult to return to a state where your emotions are easily influenced again. You begin to see the difference between connection and control, between interaction and impact, between being present and being affected. And that awareness changes how you engage moving forward. You become more selective, more intentional, more aware of what you allow to affect your emotional state. Meanwhile, the absence of influence creates a different experience on the other side of the dynamic. Actions no longer produce clear outcomes. Efforts no longer guarantee engagement. The connection no longer moves in predictable ways, and this unpredictability can feel disorienting because what once felt familiar is now uncertain. But this uncertainty is not something you need to resolve. It is the natural result of stepping out of a pattern that required your participation. Your role is not to restore the old dynamic. It is to remain aligned with the clarity that led you here. Because your indifference is not a reaction. It is a resolution. A resolution that your emotional energy will no longer be shaped by patterns that did not serve you. And in that resolution, something powerful becomes clear. When emotional influence is no longer present, control dissolves, not through conflict, not through confrontation, but through consistency, through calm, through the quiet decision to no longer be moved in ways that once felt automatic. And that is where your true strength lies, not in changing the other person, but in no longer being changed by them.